Okay, our next session is a roundtable on language behavior as a parameter for analyzing the language situation in Ukraine in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I'll hand it over to the moderator for that roundtable, who is my colleague Svitlana Melnyk.
Дякую, пані Саро. Вітаю, шановне товариство, на нашому круглому столі.
Thank you. Everyone, welcome to our roundtable. I'm very grateful to all of our participants who agreed to share their thoughts on this such an important topic. And I would like to be very concise, and I will introduce our scientists today. We have Oksana Danylevska, the PhD in philology, the senior researcher of stylistics and culture of language and social linguistics at the Institute of Ukrainian Language. She deals with the challenges of language and language legislation and and we have also Stanislava Ovseichyk, a PhD. She's working at the Philology Institute of the Kyiv National Shevchenko University, and she is researching pragmatics, semantics, communicative linguistics, and terminology studios. We also have Ivan Katsar. She's the candidate of science and philology. She's the researcher of the Department of Social Linguistics and Culture of the Institute of Ukrainian Language. Ivana is primarily dealing with psycholinguistics, the language of youth, and she's currently working on a project which is designed to evaluate the change of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian consciousness among the youth on the conditions of the war. We have also Oksana Sukhovi. She works at the Philology Institute at the Shevchenko National University, candidate of science and philology, and she's primarily dealing with the history of Ukrainian language, dialects, and Ukrainian language as a foreign language. And we also have Larisa Kisluk with us. She's the PhD in philology, senior fellow of the Institute of Ukrainian Language, National Academy of Science of Ukraine. She is particularly dealing with the lexicology of the modern Ukrainian language. So let's pass the floor at first to our colleague Oksana Danylevska. Thank you. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to say that I'm extremely happy to join such a wonderful and respectable conference. And I would like to express words of gratitude to the organizers. So I will talk about the transformation of Ukrainians' linguistic behavior in the context of Russian-Ukrainian war, based on linguistic biographies. But since we were had a previous discussion on what should we talk about during the round table, we thought that we should, talk about theory and then have a separate conversation about language behavior. And previously, the panelists were saying that human behavior is very complex and with lack of, motivation. And I would like to start with that. More specifically, I think for over 50 years, there's this statement that language cannot be learned without understanding who speaks that language, who he is, and what he feels. Therefore, when the language experts started to study the human, then they started to kind of study such a reflection as language consciousness, language behavior. But these concepts, they're still kind of very difficult for the language experts because they are outside of the linguistic analysis. The concept of linguistic behavior still has no unambiguous definition in linguistic studios. It is interpreted as a form of human social existence, which manifests the diversity of the speech actions and speech activity, and as a speech kind of act reflecting the specifics of the linguistic existence of a certain group of speakers, and as a set of relations rising during a communicative act, and as a set of rules and traditions of communication. Those researchers working in the field of communication in linguistics, they prefer the term communicative behavior. There's another term called speech behavior, which is also used. In our case, we are talking about a language behavior as a choice of languages in bilingual or multilingual situation. Having analyzed the approaches to the concept of linguistic behavior in Ukrainian linguists, social linguists offer the following definition. The linguistic behavior is the choice of a linguistic code manifested in a speech activity or socially motivated changes in the linguistic consciousness of an individual speaker or language group, and determined by a system of interrelated social, legal, psychological, social-cultural factors that are decisive in the relations language person, language community, and language society. Now, in those researches aimed at analyzing bilingual and multilingual situations or linguistic behavior, which is manifested in language choice, they consider the main criteria by which those situations are evaluated. It is seen as the component of bilingual language situation. Still, the complexity of the analysis of language behavior is all about there is a lack of research on its structure. If we take psychology, we try to analyze different things. Well, that behavior of the person is always socially determined, and the term behavior means a lot for it's in relation to its society. So it's an element of the structure of the personality. And in this case, it's important to have values, emotions, and acts. But as we've seen today, this is non-linear and not always it can be definite. In case of sociology, as for the language behavior, it's even more automated than the behavior on the overall. Then the lack of this definition in language behavior, it makes it more complex. There's this definition that there's certain rules, but on the other hand, there's a number of social factors. It becomes the interdisciplinary research is even more important, and that makes the analysts required to take into account a whole lot of different extra-linguistic factors. And currently, the aspect of the typology is still open because the researchers, they're trying to classify and to categorize the linguistic behaviors based on the concepts in these studios. They're trying to tie the types of language behavior to the type of language consciousness, or they analyze that based on the use of a different language code, or they try to relate the certain type of the language behavior with the situation in the region on overall. Now, let's have a conversation why the language behavior is something that social linguists are willing to learn. The depths of the transformation of the linguistic situation in Ukraine, which are taking place, is sometimes difficult to trace, firstly because all the relevant measurements have not been made, and sociological services cannot keep up with the changes that occur like every few months. Secondly, the qualitative changes caused by the metamorphosis of attitudes, evaluations, in public consciousness and their manifestations in linguistic behavior significantly outpace fluctuations in quantitative indicators, as they're often the result of the so-called symbolic rejection. That is why, as we have seen, the methods that allow us to record personal experience of changing attitudes, views, and behavior patterns related to language are of priority. In conditions where it is difficult or impossible to employ standard qualitative methods, the method of language biographies is particularly important. And it kind of, I should also mention that from the instrumental point of view, the method of biographies is very close to the method of interviews, and the language biography, it's the recording of an interview designed to define the peculiarities of language education, the hierarchy of the languages, how it's being built by an individual, its attitude to a certain language environment or to the ideal language environment as the person might see. And therefore, the biographies serve as the foundation for the analysis of social aspects of an individual and its language. And we can build the language portrait of a person within certain historic period. The active linguistic behavior of citizens and changes in attitudes towards a language and the language consciousness of societies have led to an unprecedented communicative power of the Ukrainian language in the informal and semi-official spheres. Over the 10 months of the first year of the full-scale war, the number of Ukrainians using Ukrainian language on the everyday basis have increased from 64 to 81%. That's according to the European Initiatives Foundation. The external manifestation of this trend is the massive transition to Ukrainian in everyday communication. And based on the language biographies that we've recorded after the full-scale war, it appears that the language biography, which is a language transition, meaning when Russian is no longer used in all the communicative situations. Now, this was called by one of the respondents as something that I stopped answering in Russian when I got a question in Russian. So I'm not using Russian, and I'll no longer use Russian. So that transition is not kind of a fast decision, and language biographies kind of point to that. In fact, this goes along to the change in the consciousness under the effects of the war. We are primarily talking about the model language for most of the people who were using Russian in the daily life. They were sort of basing their ideas on the first language that they were using. In some cases, people were saying that they had two model languages, and the Ukrainian sociology experts, at certain stage, they were suggesting this answer, that there's like two model languages. One model language, Ukrainian, that's a part of the heritage, respect to the country you live in. But then the second model language, Russian language, was considered as basic, as the one that was comprehended as the first language. Now that was the idea that changed. So the respondent answering the question whether her understanding of the model language has changed over the time, over the period of her life. And she said, like in 2014, she started to think about that. And then she radically changed her point when the full-scale invasion started. She said that I really want to think that my native language is Ukrainian, because it's disgusting to think that my native language is Russian. And the language biographies stand that these people are reevaluating a lot of what is happening in their country. Just want to retell what it's all about.
Про те мовне середовище, в якому вони
The
жили.
language environment where they lived, they were speaking like breathing. And the situation which seemed to them, which was in fact declarative and was not a conflict from beyond, it seemed to them that finally it doesn't matter. The main thing that the person is good. But now the experience has changed, and it gives us to estimate in a different way what took place in the past. And now such people understand that it's not just like that to create a language community. They document that as for Ukrainian language, that was a kind of neglection. In the kindergartens, in the schools, it was never articulated, it was never spoken about, but this kind of neglection really made those who could speak Ukrainian to use Russian language, to move to Russian language communicating with the people of the same age. So it also witnesses about the certain behavioral tactics from the situational use, first with the strangers in the streets, in the trading spots with separate family members, to the decision to move to Ukrainian with their friends and in the family. This respondent tells that she did not instantly transfer to Ukrainian with the beginning of the full-scale war, that when she was in Poland, she was shocked how many Ukrainians are using Russian, and that was totally incomprehensible for her. And under these conditions, with the people who she didn't know, she began to speak Ukrainian. And she started to speak Ukrainian with the husband, who went to the army. He went to the armed forces of Ukraine on the 4th of March. He could not speak Russian with him and with her mother. And later, much later, in a year, in March 2023, when this was the first time when she met her husband in Lviv with the family, with her children, then they were totally intuitively speaking Ukrainian, and they never came back to Russian. And that's what's important out of those strategies and tactics, how to have this transition. It's important to mention such a detail that people are mostly searching for favorable situations, circumstances, which would psychologically ease in this transition between languages. And separately, I need to emphasize on the search of the format for transition, which would be not that traumatic for the children, and the understanding of the responsibility of the adults. Not to waste your time, let me name a quote. It was hard to have a transition for the adolescent girl, and who was her elder daughter, and to motivate and explain, she explained it as an adult person. For an adult person, without playing, she explained the circumstances, what will happen if we go on speaking Russian, and the reason why we transferred to Ukrainian. We have lots of reasons like that, and we should go on, going on and speaking about that in Russian would be an obvious responsibility. The people who are adults, they are responsible whether their children are Ukrainian speaking. If the adults don't use this matter of principle, then we cannot expect that it will take place on its own. So the method of language biography is an important tool for the research of language situation, because it gives the opportunity to comprehensively involve the quantitative and qualitative and estimated parameters in this process. It is invaluable during the war because it gives us the opportunity to provide a research when we cannot use the standard methods of research. And these excerpts, which I meant, well, as I'm short of time, they're not that numerous, but they explain why according to the sociological polls, those 7% of the increase of the number of people who are using Ukrainian in the daily life during the first year of the war is in fact a lot, which this number is decisively impacting the dynamic of the language situation in our state. In a nutshell, that's it. If there are any questions, I'm ready to answer. Thank you, Oksana, for such an interesting speech. Thank you so much. Ms. Stanislava, please, the floor is yours. Good evening, dear colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I will follow up the topic of Oksana, but in comparison, I'm not the sociolinguist, I'm the terminologist. And this topic was inspired by my personal experience because during the war, I had an opportunity to analyze the posts and to communicate with the Ukrainians who had to leave Ukraine for Luxembourg. And I was impressed, as it was mentioned by Oksana, about the certain biography of your respondent, that in fact, not that many Ukrainians are communicating in Ukrainian. And answering my question why it happens like that, someone told that it is a tradition, it's our legacy, we are from the East. Someone said that we had Russian as a native language in the family, so that's an issue for them. And when I offered to use Ukrainian in the chat in Luxembourg, because we are Ukrainians, in fact, how can we identify ourselves as Ukrainians, not only through the documents, but through the language, some traditions and culture, what we could add to the culture of Luxembourg? By the way, for the Luxembourg, they have 3 state languages: Luxembourg, German, and French. And what's interesting, in fact, if you'd like to have some kind of a nice status, work of a job of a high status, ideally you need to know 3 languages. And what's interesting, our compatriots were interested to study these 3 languages. I communicated with people who were actively searching for language courses. In fact, they are provided by the state, but there are certain details about that. And upon the request to speak Ukrainian, there were just wild reactions. What's the issue? Don't you understand Russian? We have always spoken Russian and we don't see any issue. Why did we move to Luxembourg and we need to speak Ukrainian? For me, it was savage, honestly, because even my colleagues from Luxembourg University, when they asked me, why your Ukrainians say Kyiv, not Kyiv? And I had to explain that, in fact, the Russian option is sounding like that, Kyiv. It was not that convenient because we were perceived as Ukrainians. That's about the idea itself. And when I already started analyzing and speaking to different people by age, by status, they were rather rich people who were selling their businesses, moved to start up a new business there, and the academics as well, academicians from different universities of Ukraine as well. The problem maybe was that we are now moving closer to the term which is in my speech, the life strategy. The term life strategy has been used in the scientific field relatively recently, because mostly the word strategy is perceived as the term from management or marketing. But in fact, we can find the ideas of life strategy already in the works of certain psychologists and even psychiatrists of the 20th century, like Erich Fromm, as far as I remember, and Viktor Frankl, and so on. Even the Soviet works mentioned that, well, I mean Soviet Ukrainian works, which also had certain ideas about such a notion. And it seems to me this very notion explains why so many compatriots of ours are perceiving it as something really weird, this kind of transition into Ukrainian under the conditions of war, when they are already abroad. They consider that this transition is not a necessity. It is not embedded into their life strategy. Why? Because they would like to adapt, they would like to find nice jobs, well, relatively nice conditions, and they are obliged to study the languages which would allow them to gain this kind of a positive adaptation experience. So it turns out that, in fact, the studying of foreign languages is within their strategy. But living here in Ukraine and getting, in fact, both material and other goods, the opportunities to study, to communicate in Russian, they never had such a need. So, in fact, as for me, those are rather pragmatic issues which were mentioned by Oksana before. And it seems to me that to, in fact, change it, to make a shift, we need to speak about the proper language policy, which unfortunately is not that well working in our country and was not working during the 30 years. And it is not about the people, it's more about the state. But going on with the topic of the life strategy, how it is understood today as a notion. It is understood as a strategy for finding, motivating, and realizing a personality in life by correlating life requirements with personal activity, values, and the way of self-expression. So we can see that, in fact, motivation, why do I need that? If your Ukrainian language is not native, if you perceive it as a foreign language, there should be some objective, some aim, why we should study that. And if you do not have such an objective, and in fact, the person living in Ukraine and communicating Russian felt convenient, why he or she would do that? Again, it's a question. But again, if we speak about Ukrainians who are Russian-speaking in the context of Kyiv city, where I can analyze the situation, I may say that even my surrounding, the Russian-speaking people, I have some, still, through self-realizing, they began to communicate in all of the spheres of their life in Ukrainian. But it's again self-recognizing. It's a different reason, not pragmatic element which are influencing, but the understanding that this is the language of the occupants. And I don't want to use the language of the occupants who are killing our people and destroying our country. So as for me, what's important is the understanding, as it was said, by the way, in a very interesting book. I can recommend you Krzysztof Zanussi, a famous Polish film director, in the Strategy of Life, How to Eat Candy and to Have It, that we are influencing the events more frequently than we think. And in the situations where beyond our control, we can at least decide what position to take to resist unfavorable fate. So as for me, the choice of the language still depends on ourselves. And of course, we consider the circumstances, the surrounding, the situation where we are now at or can be found at. But the main factor is the acknowledged and conscious need and the wish, especially now when we are gaining this experience of life under the conditions of Russo-Ukrainian war. And it seems to me that when our strategy is just imagined as a certain a multifaceted approach, but those facets are created taking into consideration the national identity, we still imagine ourselves Ukrainians in the perspective, then the change in the language behavior will take place. If not, then unfortunately, we will again have bilingual communication as a phenomenon, and this bilingual approach is even broadcast by our compatriots from abroad. When my colleagues told me, why your people are speaking Russian, what's the point then? So in a nutshell, that's it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, Stanislava, that you shared your ideas. Now, Ivana, please. Hello, dear colleagues. Thank you to the previous speakers because they've already said a lot what I was planning to say. But in fact, still, the topic of my research is the psycholinguistic view of the linguistic behavior of Ukrainian youth during a full-scale war. As it was already mentioned, many young people have changed their language behavior. They had this transition from Russian to Ukrainian, but there are some who are not going to do that and haven't done that. In this report, I will be speaking about the ones who are in Ukraine, not the ones who fled from Ukraine. And simultaneously, their language behavior and consciousness is always also changing, consciously or subconsciously. And some of those changes and their reasons and also emotions which are accompanying the language behavior will be analyzed looking at the examples of the biographies of Ukrainian youth recorded during the full-scale war. First of all, I'd like to emphasize several language ideologists, which are deeply rooted, often unconscious ideas about language and its connection to society that can be traced in the language biographies of the respondents. First of all, language equals to ethnicity, to native speaker, to personality. Secondly, the ideology friend or foe. And the third is language is just a means of communication. Identification of the language with the person who speaks it is evident in numerous examples. For example, informants point to numerous cases when they feel disgusted or anxious when hearing Russian on the street, in public transport, or in other public places. This is especially true for young people who have experienced trauma. In such cases, disgust with the Russian language can even escalate into language conflicts. It is well illustrated by the example. Respondent is Oksana, 22 years, from Lviv. She lost her brother in the war, and she is having dinner in a Lviv restaurant with her mother. A group of young men sits nearby and discusses something loudly and cheerfully in Russian. According to Oksana, she and her mother almost had a nervous breakdown. Let me quote, "Even though we understood that these were their private conversations, that it wasn't in a supermarket, we couldn't listen to that language. My mom called the waiter to say something to them. It's not normal that they shout so shamelessly in the language of murderers." Another example is the Crimean Tatar Elvina, originally from Kherson, left for Germany. She is told how she came to the playground with her child and said, "I come to a playground where I hear Russian and I look at people with caution. I don't trust them anymore." One more interesting example is from Kyiv. Respondent Yulia, 32 years old. She says, "I am so nervous, so nervous. I'm taking my son to the kindergarten. We are riding in the elevator. A neighbor comes in and starts talking to my son in Russian. I tell her, do not speak to my child in Russian. He doesn't understand. I don't want him to know the language of the occupiers." So she starts, "Oh, your Ukrainian language. We are so tired of that. Do you understand? What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to protect my child from this language when it's everywhere?" So we can see this really identification of the Russian language with the occupants, the ideology of friend or foe, where Ukrainian is your language and Russian is foreign, is well illustrated by the linguistic biography of Ivan, a soldier from Kharkiv region who is currently fighting in the Ukrainian armed forces. He tells that he himself switched to Ukrainian and even his mother did that. But though he was trying to use that anywhere, he still speaks Russian in his brigade because most of his brethren in arms speak it. It is uncomfortable psychologically with standing out. Though in the liberated territories, he and other guys from his brigade speak only Ukrainian with the local population so that the locals understand that they are friends. And speakers crossing the checkpoints also talk about this transition. On the Ukrainian side, we speak Ukrainian. But unfortunately, we also observe a different situation when young people in the newly occupied territories are forced to switch to Russian in order to appear their own to the Russians, because it is the only way sometimes to survive, to stay alive. This is what the above-mentioned Elvina told about her younger nieces who remained in the occupied part of the Kherson region. Unlike their parents, were already very fluent in Ukrainian and spoke it, but under the occupation, they were forced to return to Russian. The girls' linguistic consciousness has not changed. They're still supporters of Ukrainian, but their linguistic behavior has.
So this unwillingness to stand out, to kind of integrate into the language environment, is the reason for the change of language behavior of Russian-speaking IDPs who find themselves in a Ukrainian-speaking environment. But their transition to Ukrainian is often only external and public and can be caused by purely pragmatic factors, just to avoid conflicts, or it could be, based on stereotypes, because we are in Lviv and everyone speaks Ukrainian here, and we were told never to speak Russian in Lviv. So all these cases of switching to Ukrainian can be considered as something that is caused by the war or the change of language consciousness. Well, the transition is about overcoming internal barriers. It takes effort and time. And those who had previously planned to switch but did not dare, those who realized the role of language in identity formation under the influence of the war, and those who were previously ashamed of their Ukrainian because of their imperfect command of it. Now, everyone individually determines for themselves how much effort they are willing to make to change their linguistic behavior. Now, another example of Nastya, age 18, she currently lives in Kyiv, and out of the outbreak of full-scale war, she started to speak only Ukrainian in public spaces, including social media, but she continues to speak Russian in her family. She says it's a bit difficult. I can speak fluently in Ukrainian, but I may forget certain words. So I need to think a little bit to translate from Russian to Ukrainian. I think that at home you can speak as you want. So for her, it's kind of a comfort area. And she believes that this has no impact on the language situation in the country. Now, before the full-scale war, when we've studied the change in linguistic behavior of young people from Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea after moving to Kyiv, we found out that one of the significant obstacles to switching to Ukrainian was shame for the imperfect command of Ukrainian language. Well, now this factor is not that important. For example, a Crimean Tatar named Rada says that on the 24th of February, she had no shame or nothing. She had some knowledge of Ukrainian. Maybe she wasn't perfect, but I didn't care whether I had an accent or not, although I seemed as if I hadn't had an accent. Now, as we are coming to another question, which is so important, why some of the Ukrainian young people are not switching to Ukrainian or try to switch it first and then go back to speaking Russian? Well, since there's more and more Ukrainians transitioning to Ukrainian language or starting to respond to the violation of the language legislation, those who do not want to change their linguistic behavior, they feel kind of, or they participate in language conflicts because they subconsciously have this negative impact to Russian, and they take it as them too personally. And there's some sort of a psychological aspect because they are protesting against any restrictions, which is something which is very common among young people. For example, Ruslan, I've spoken Russian all my life and Suzyk, but after the full scale, I started to get angry that they started to divide us by language. There's another interesting example of Anastasia from Kirovohrad region. She believes herself Ukrainian only because she is born in Ukraine, but she doesn't understand what her mother language is. Well, maybe Ukrainian, because I was told that in school. And she feels that before the war, everyone were speaking Russians because everyone around her were speaking Russian. And she's also saying that, she's not willing to confront her to anyone, and she thinks that it's more than enough to know to speak Russian. And that girl was feeling tough or cool because she was speaking Russian, because all of her surrounding all the people were using Suzyk. So if compared to Suzyk, her Russian language felt cool, even despite that most of the classmates started to switch to Ukrainian. But now the situation has changed, so now it's more popular. It's better to speak Ukrainian, and Anastasia is not trying to understand the changes, why this situation has changed. Now she's feeling angry because she's not cool anymore, and her prestige dropped. And then some of the other people might have a negative attitude toward her. But besides, the language identity and the lack of language consciousness, they destroy the language identity of the person. So whether Anastasia can change her identity, she said yes, but when talking to a Ukrainian interviewer, she tries to speak Ukrainian. It's not perfect, so if there will be Ukrainian language environment and if there will be Ukrainian around her, she will talk Ukrainian. So as a kind of summary, we can come up with the following reasons why the Russian-speaking youth is not transitioning to Ukraine after the full-scale war. First is the lack of national consciousness and the blurriness of linguistic identity. The reasons for this mostly in childhood and are primarily related to the kind of upbringing in the family and preschool and school. Then there is a narrow social circle because there was no need to speak Ukraine. There's stereotypes and the idea that everyone speaks Russian, lack of knowledge of Ukrainian language, and accordingly there's some difficulties while talking Ukrainian, and the level of education, which is based on the examples from Crimean Tatars coming to Kyiv. And we were asking why some of the Tatars started to speak Ukrainian, others not. And we were told that those who had a higher level of education transferred to Ukrainian, well, that would need to be kind of verified with additional researchers and through the higher level of consciousness, because those people who were nationally conscious, they moved. And in conclusion, I would like to say that changing language behavior is a multidimensional problem. We're talking not only about behavior during communication in real life, because there are, the linguistic behavior around people on the internet, where they spend a lot of time, is changing or not changing. Let me give you a few examples of and there's an interesting, in fact, example of Tatiana from Lviv. She's nationally consciousness. She never switches to Russian. She can make, comments to staff who address her to Russian, but she continues to watch movies and TV series on the internet, even during a full-scale war, explaining that she sees the language only as a tool and she needs to escape from reality somewhere to get emotional relief. And there is lack of Ukrainian language products, even despite the improvement of the language situation on the internet. And well, she cannot refuse herself and wait for some movie in Ukrainian dubbing to be released later, or maybe not released later. Here we can also talk about some certain psychological issues of young people. There's their dependence on sources of quick gratification like games, social networks, and their unwillingness to sacrifice their comfort. So undoubtedly, the changes in language consciousness of Ukrainians are embodied in changes in linguistic behavior. However, it is not always consciousness that changes. Sometimes it's only behavior, for pragmatic reasons or not. At the same time, we assume that changes of linguistic behavior may, in the long term, influence changes in linguistic consciousness. In our opinion, this is a complex, interconnected process that requires further detailed study. Thank you. We thank for you for such an interesting statement. In fact, we'd like to pass the floor to Oksana Danylevska. Please continue. I beg your pardon. Greetings, everyone. I'm extremely happy to have this opportunity and participate in this conference. And frankly speaking, after today's attack and a building close to mine was significantly damaged, and even my own building was a bit damaged. So in the morning, I feel depressed, but now in the middle of this conference, I have my mood changed, which is something that I'm very grateful about. So let me start my presentation. Give me a second. I will run my presentation. Okay, so hopefully you can see this presentation. I've changed my topic slightly. Let me explain you why. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, millions of Ukrainian citizens have become forced migrants. Some of them were able to return and continue. They leave at home, but hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians lost their homes and they have to adapt to new living conditions. Adults have to look for new jobs, and school children, despite the tragedy of the situation, they would still need to get an education. That's our future. That's our generation that will replace us. So a lot of attention is being focused on them. And I would also like to use the quotation of Otto von Bismarck: the enemy is not coming where the professor or the teacher is available. So we need to bring our new generation as something that is nationally conscious, and the language and culture are very important for that. So I would like to talk about the peculiarities of the adaptation of the school children of Ukraine to primary and secondary schools in Poland. At first, I wanted to mention Reims in France because it happens so that I've been to Europe in January. I had a chance to observe something. There's some questions arise. This is where I got the interest to this topic. But I had to kind of narrow down my briefing, otherwise I won't have enough time. So why Poland? Why do we have this information? Well, historically, Poland is not only one of Ukraine's closest neighbors. Well, as you can see that on the map, it means that we have a common history. and close economic and cultural ties. Our languages are quite close, so it's easier for Ukrainians to adapt in Poland if compared to Germany, France, or other countries speaking non-Slavic languages. So there's some advantages and disadvantages. Poland is a fairly large country, 9th by the area and 8th by the population. Its area is only half the size of Ukraine's, and its population, well, before the full-scale invasion was around 38 million people. Now, all of that is a prerequisite for the fact that in May 2022, Poland hosted 3.37 million Ukrainian citizens. So that's over 3 million. Now, should you compare it with the population of Poland, that's around 8% of the Polish population. Now, this is why Poland has faced with the challenge of hosting a significant number of Ukrainian school children and creating a most favorable atmosphere or environment for them. Now, a lot will depend on Polish people. I mean, how the Ukrainian children would look like upon returning to Ukraine. Now, I would like to focus on different approaches to developing not only an educational trajectory for students from Ukraine, but also approaches to learning the language and culture. According to Center for Civic Education, there's around 293,000 school children and students displaced from Ukraine. They live in Poland. So take a look. There's around 185,000 students from Ukraine that study in Polish schools. Now, you can see that there's around 135,000 of them are war refugees. The rest are children of economic migrants who came to Poland earlier. Now, in Poland, refugee school children make up almost 3% of all students. Now, that's the information as of the end of February this year. Now, there's also approximately around 150,000 refugee children from Ukraine outside of the Polish education system. Now, if all Ukrainian students in Poland would go to school, it would amount to 7% of the students. Now, according to the Deputy Minister of Education of Poland, Jana Mucha, some of them study in Ukrainian online schools, but it is not known to what extent these children actually fulfill their educational duties. None of the Polish side checked this, so it's difficult to determine to what extent the distance education system is really preparing them for the life. But the biggest problem, however, is those children who are and the poll suggests that there may be a large group of them are not enrolled in any educational system, meaning there's a generation which is not receiving any type of education. Then Jana Mucha also said that starting from the new school year, the Polish educational system can accept another 50,000-60,000 refugee children from Ukraine, and the number in Polish schools and kindergartens will increase to about 240,000. Now, in addition, about 20,000 children in the final years of school, grades 9 through 11, will need to take final or unit exams to universities, and there's no mechanisms for that. I know from the experience of my colleagues and friends how difficult it was to pass them an MT in Poland. There was not enough centers. The system of due diligence were not very developed. So we're talking about a fairly significant number of students and school students in order to, be able to fully adapt to exclusively Polish educational systems, because children need to learn and preserve their language, culture, and ultimately national identity. So there's a need for Ukrainian language, geography, history, and literature subjects. And Polish people clearly understand this because they also respect the national identity in it, something that is very important. Therefore, the school education is moving in the following direction. First, there's a possibility of integrating into Polish school in Poland. Surely there are preparatory classes for that to help children learn Polish well enough to kind of be enrolled in the general education system. But then we're talking about Polish school, Polish consciousness. Then there's intercultural assistance who help students to find their place. There's enough of them currently. Then the pre-class might take 2 or 3 semesters. The children, they easily learn Polish and then switch to Polish. In some cases, the child might, learn Polish in 1 semester, and they might be integrating real fast. It's easier to learn Polish for those people who speak Ukrainian. Now, the Polish legislation stipulates that a child entering Polish educational system has the right to be accompanied by intercultural assistant at least during the first year of study, and then it become fully integrated into the Polish system. Now, challenges. There's conflicts between Polish and Ukrainian children. There's bullying. In many cases, there's bullying on behalf of the teachers. So the children get closed. They the Russian speaking, they have their own challenges. Now, the risks for those children enrolling into the Polish school. It's the full integration into the Polish society. And in this case, we might lose these children for Ukrainian state. The second is studying in the Ukrainian schools in Poland. The Ukrainian schools that were established over the past couple of years as a response to the fact that children did not want to go to Polish schools. And there's tens of thousands of people who study there. The problem is that these schools operate outside the Polish educational system. So the ministry also, our ministry cannot control them as well. I can mention a series of educational projects in school. For example, first Ukrainian school in Poland. That's an initiative established in March 2022. We have Ukrainian schools in Warsaw, Wrocław, and Krakow. They provide children with all the necessary materials for learning. And during the summer holidays, the first Ukrainian school in Poland, there's Polish-Ukrainian clubs for children of all ages. There's every conditions for the adaptation, and the purpose of their establishment is to learn Polish. Now, in April 2022, the Warsaw Ukrainian School was founded, and it gave children a chance to finish the school year in accordance with the Ukrainian education system. The school continued to operate. I'm not going to talk about this, and surely the textbooks that are used by the teachers, these are our Ukrainian textbooks approved by our ministry. They are ordered in Poland, printed, and transported. I would like to just to mention a few words about Study UA. That's a project that was started in September 2023. This is available in Poland. It's kind of a boarding school where every class has around 20 children. There's a good balanced language policy, which is wonderful because in accordance to the statute, outside of school, you can speak Polish, Ukrainian, or English. Russian is prohibited. So that is a step that has to be reinforced in all the schools for Ukrainian children.
That's a rather important issue, and they have a very serious approach for the selection of teachers through the interviews and trial lessons. This is a good school, but tuition is paid and it's not available to all migrants. Out of the advantages of the Ukrainian schools, because I can name others, free schools like Nezlamna, Materinka, that is unbreakable, in fact, and out of the advantages that the teachers are being integrated into the European educational system, and when they come back to Ukraine, they can implement this experience here. They have lots of integrated courses, like Ukrainian and foreign language or literature are taught as one course, and as you know, we have separate ones in Ukraine. A serious issue is exams. So therefore, it is planned that already in 2025-26 academic year, it will be possible to take the external independent test in Polish alongside the EIT in Ukrainian, who can adequately assess the risks. The lack of communication so far with the Ukrainian Education Ministry and so on. Now, and the third way, again, conflicts between Russian and Ukrainian speaking conflicts, they did not disappear. Another way is the remote training in Ukraine, but we understand gradually that it is not as efficient, not as full as it could be, but so far it is working. So, what can be done about that? For instance, the vice president of Lublin, Mariusz Banach, says that about 100 teachers from Ukraine are currently working in Lublin schools, and there is a necessity to implement Ukrainian language lessons in schools when the Polish people, not the migrants, will study Ukrainian. He explained that so as the Ukrainian language, in order for the Ukrainian language to function in schools on the same basis as German or French, for example, to be able to take the external independent evaluation, a basic curriculum developed by the Ministry of Education is needed. Negotiations on this issue are ongoing. And if this were to happen, it would be possible to teach Ukrainian in all schools in Poland in 2024. Then it would become the second modern language of choice. And Ukrainian activist Igor Isayev says that in Polish cities where a significant percentage of the population is Ukrainian, it is possible to fight for the language so that Ukrainian becomes the second state language. But this is the irritating and sensitive issue. I'm just telling about the options of language policy. He suggests testing the possibility of placing bilingual signs in cities such as Wrocław, where 28% of the population is currently Ukrainian. There are just over 250,000 of them. In Warsaw, for instance, 14% are Ukrainians. In Lublin, for instance, they already implemented the pilot project. Teachers from Ukraine are teaching in Polish schools. If the community, that is the parents of the children going to that school, decided, they study Ukrainian. And by the way, the intelligentsia is really interested to do that. They order textbooks from Ukraine. So concluding, I may say that we can see a huge interest in the formation of educational trajectory for the Ukrainian school children in Poland, but it's important for our educational employees to be involved and state authorities as well, not to lose this generation, so as this generation was interested to come back. So we need to help the situation so as the Ukrainian schools or the schools with the Ukrainian language of teaching or with the studies of Ukrainian language were rather active and they were numerous. That is our generation. Thank you so much for your attention. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to its heroes. Thank you so much, Oksana, for such a relative topic. Thank you for such an interesting report and speech. Larissa, please, the floor is yours. Thank you. Dear colleagues, first and foremost, thank you, the organizers of the conference. You are giving the floor to the Ukrainian academicians and the platform to be heard in the world. That is so important. My presentation, Language and Self-Identification of Ukrainians on Facebook and Telegram, provides certain observations over Ukrainians' active participation in social media over the past 2 years of war in the topic of language and self-identification, that is, in groups united by place of residence or certain interests, and in the so-called virtual bubble, which mostly consists for me of the people mainly with a humanitarian education and a conscious pro-Ukrainian position, which is felt in the comments. In the groups, the language issues and language behavior is not discussed that frequently. The administrators mostly say that social media are the public space and with Ukrainian language of communication. For instance, in Kyiv Telegram group, at the place of residence на Теремках, at Teremki, that is more than 5,000 members in 2022, there were still comments in Russian. In 2023, a chatbot was introduced, which politely responded to messages and remarks in Russian, reminding that the language of communication in the group is Ukrainian. Since the beginning of 2024, the chatbot has no longer been functioning. The group uses Ukrainian, and for some rare messages or comments in Russian, the chat administrator responds to them, making comments or deleting them. Compared to Ukrainian refugee groups on Facebook, In 2024, members of one of the groups, about 1,300 members, they complained that they were desperate because they have not met a single Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainian, only Russian-speaking ones. And language for her is an indicator of their own and matters. And there are participants who can see that Russian identity is rejected, or Ukrainian identity is rejected. They are afraid to associate themselves with Ukraine due to fear for their safety and the safety of their children in some European countries. They avoid mentioning Ukraine as a result of Russia's information warfare, which sows waves of hatred towards Ukrainians around the world. It can be assumed that the feeling of insecurity makes some Ukrainians use mimicry as a defense strategy. On the contrary, language and linguistic and cultural topics related to identity are actively discussed in public posts on Facebook, from several hundreds to several dozens of comments to the posts. The most active discussion is the behavior of public figures in the public space. For example, scandals provoked by Irina Faryon's interview with Yanina Sokolova or Kristina Solovey's interview with Masha Yefrosinina. Rather active discussions are connected to a specific cultural content, like the musical You Romance or Russian cartoons for Ukrainian children. And not that actively, this is the discussion about the switching to Ukrainian, observing the dynamics of the percentage of Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Kyiv residents. The opinions of the discussion participants often diametrically opposed. They give an understanding of the position of Ukrainian citizens on issue of language, culture, and identity. And they also show certain trends in Ukrainian society, in particular through the stories of individuals. So I will quote them. Discussion of the behavior of famous people in the public space related to sensitive language issue stirs up considerable passions in social media. In the essence of these well-known scandals was the expression in the first case, that is the language scandal with Irina Faryon in the center, in November 2023, was the expression of radical views in public discussions, which in particular affects the country's image abroad. And in the second, the dispute between Kristina Solovey and Masha Yefrosinina in the beginning of March of the current year is about the responsibility of public figures for their values and worldview. Let me quote one of the positions expressed on Facebook. The language scandal with Faryon is a mixing of the assessment of compliance with the law and the assessment of the dignity and Ukrainianness of people who do not comply with it. Yes, it is very bad when people do not comply with the law, and even such an important law for our independence as the language law, especially when they do so blatantly. However, it is even worse to declare all violators to be scoundrels and deprive them of their right to be Ukrainians. This is not conducive not only to national unity, but also to individual motivation to use the Ukrainian language. End of quote. In short, despite the desire for the Ukrainian language to finally dominate the public space of Ukraine as a lingua franca, radical steps are not welcomed by the wider public, especially when they are associated with a threat to life in the temporarily occupied territories. Let me quote several comments from Facebook which characterize the importance for the society of the worldview, position, and self-identity of the people who are willing to get popularity or leadership in the community. A quote: "Those of us who sided with Solovey in her dispute with Yefrosinina did so quite instinctively, on the level of recognizing our own or a stranger, friend or foe. This is not a linguistic dispute, but a completely ideological one. Our main complaint against the collective Masha Yefrosinina is that they all came to replace the destroyed sprouts of Ukrainian mass culture in the 90s as distinctly pro-Russian culture traffickers. End of quote. Another opinion. An artist makes his or her choice in accordance with his or her values and worldview and is responsible for his or her actions and their consequences. And the responsibility of public people is much higher than that of a non-public person, because they have a huge influence on the formation of the values and worldview of the masses of people, and they are morally responsible for this influence. End of quote. And one more quote. In the 90s, there was a boom in Ukrainian performers and Ukrainian language music, but all the compilations of Ukrainian hits of the 2000s are already in Russian. How did this happen? Because Moscow's direct protégés got to the highest positions in the country. And the first thing these agents took on was the Russification of cultural space and education. And this process continued until the Revolution of Dignity, although they have no intention of stopping even after it. Every bend to the occupier, to its language and culture, every tolerance of collaborationism, so-called whatever, humiliation and destruction of Ukrainianness, every weakness and cowardice in this 300-year war has a price: blood and death. End of quote. People in the comments also tell about their position through their own stories. And by the way, they really are similar to the above-mentioned language biographies. They are worthy to be mentioned, at least some of them. For instance, story number 1 about the lack of cultural and language environment for the formation of the Ukrainian identity. I come from the southeast, and I could hardly have this difference between Russian and Ukrainian. It was a common space for me, linguistically and culturally. At the same time, I have never had a pro-Russian position, always believing that Ukraine is a separate independent state that should stick to the European vector. As I nurture my Ukrainian identity as an adult, I try to understand how the boundaries between Ukrainian and Russian were methodically erased in the part of Ukraine where I was born, how the myth of one people was imposed on us. The optics were always Russian. Of course, I had some fragmentary knowledge and experience of interacting with Ukrainian culture, but in order to understand the Ukrainian culture more deeply, I had to search for it, learn about it, and take an interest in it. No one forbade me to do this before, but I had no demand. I fully satisfied my cultural needs with Russian, because it was constantly offered to me through the Russian language and culture. And out of the 7 schools in my hometown, 6 were Russian language schools, with subjects taught in Russian using Russian language textbooks. And this was in the 90s, at the time of independence. The insidious, creeping advance of Russia. I am still filling in the gaps in my identity. Story number 2. About language dynamics of the 5 generations of Ukrainians in Donbass. I was born and raised in Bakhmut. I am the 5th generation from Donbass. My great-grandmother, whom I remember very well, was born in 1906 and spoke Ukrainian. My grandmother was spoke Surzhyk, and my mother and I were already Russian speakers. My husband and I switched to Ukrainian since the full-scale invasion. It is not easy, but I am glad that today my 6-year-old son speaks Ukrainian and makes comments to me if I forget. I brought Ukrainian back to my family, not for the sake of anyone, not for the sake of hype or because it's fashionable. There are many people like me. And the third story, about the conscious choice of Ukrainian identity. I have friends whose parents moved from Ural, but they politically identified themselves as Ukrainians. It is a choice. End of quote. So the participants of the discussion of this interview in Facebook precisely understand the significance of language and culture for the identification of Ukrainians. And they say that being a Ukrainian was never easy. But as a commenter says, I am irritated that they search for the reason between us, but is always beyond us, that is Russians. And when there was no resilience, it was not just because like that, but because it was demolished for the longer time and they did it bolder. And the war happened not because we were Russian speaking or with Russian culture, but because we stopped being like that. Discussions in Facebooks of the shift from Ukrainian to Russian, we have such a problem as Russian language of adolescents in Kyiv. In the reactions of the commentators for the post of Volodymyr Kulik on the 23rd of December of 2023, is there more Russian on the streets of Kyiv? There are such words, an opinion. More than half of Kyiv residents speak Ukrainian steadily, including Surzhyk. The proportion of Russian speakers among school children in Kyiv is much higher than average, and this is a serious problem. Another comment confirms. I walk around Obolony, part of city, listening to what language people speak. Adults speak about 60% Ukrainian. Small children who walk with their parents speak mostly Ukrainian. Teenagers and high school students, I have two schools nearby, speak only Russian. There are expectations and hopes that the transition to Ukrainian by TikTokers, Instagram bloggers, the emergence of Ukrainian YouTube, mass popular culture in Ukrainian will pull the younger generation, teenagers, along with them. And they will also switch to Ukrainian because their idols speak Ukrainian. And finally, I would like to emphasize the dynamics of the understanding of Ukrainianness as a civic category, when there is a conscious choice of nationality and identity is chosen, as well as language, re-identification as a change of identification. Sociologist Volodymyr Kulik in the post in Facebook, and there is the article in the newspaper, Historical Truth, mentioned a very important point. Let me quote. Ethnical identity in the world today is defined not only by the origin, but by the choice. And in Ukraine, this factor has become decisive, especially after 2014. If we are happy that in Ukraine more than 90 or maybe even more than 95% of citizens identify themselves as Ukrainians, then we need to understand that the increase from the census of 78% has become possible because of re-identification of those who used to say that they were Russians. And if some of them may have simply returned to the identity rejected in imperial times, the vast majority decided to be Ukrainians despite their Russian as well as Jewish, Belarusian or other ancestry. In this way, they changed the very meaning of Ukrainianness. It is no longer a hereditary category, but a civic one. End of quote. This conclusion is based on the results of the survey, where the overwhelming majority, 92%, agree that all Ukrainian citizens who want to be Ukrainians can be, and 38% are inclined to believe that the Ukrainian nation includes only those citizens of Ukraine, regardless of ethnicity, who speak Ukrainian, observe Ukrainian national traditions, and bring up their children in them. So, modern Ukrainian identity is formed primarily by behavior, not by origin. Moreover, self-identification is a conscious choice in life, and a person becomes a Ukrainian by demonstrating this choice in everyday life. This is a somewhat unexpected conclusion for me. I don't know whether countering propaganda impacted that. Yes, obviously it did. And the social networks confirm that. Thank you. Glory to Ukraine. Thank you so much, Larissa. Glory to the heroes. Dear friends, that was incredibly interesting, bright reports, which makes think, and they led to really lively discussion. But we have to finalize our meeting, unfortunately. This is the end of the work of our roundtable. I would like to conclude that in 2016,
публікувала статтю.
Lada Bilenuk, a researcher from Canada, published an article about language ideologies, and she describes two ideologies. The language doesn't matter and the language matters. So the ideology, the language does not matter, may seem liberal, may seem to foresee individual freedom of choice, but under the situation when the language is partially used as an excuse in the war, the language always matters. So at this note, I would like to finalize the work of our round table, and I'm incredibly grateful to all of our speakers who have been joining our relevant and interesting and important conversation. Thank you so much. We had a wonderful first day of the work. I thank all of the speakers, all the ones who were involved, our interpreters who were tirelessly working with us today. And I do remind you that tomorrow we are starting our
Годині ранку о
working day
15.
at 9 a.m. or at 3 p.m. Kyiv time. We hope that Oksana Zabushko would join our conference as well, and she will have a plenary lecture. We are waiting for all of you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Kyiv time or at 9 a.m. Bloomington time. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.
Героям слава, дякуємо.
Бачення.
До побачення.
До побачення.